Hello, everyone. Welcome to our video today on understanding the pathway to violence. My name is Marisa Randazzo. I'm CEO here at Sigma Threat Management Associates, and I'm here today with Cynthia Marble, who is our Chief Operating Officer here at Sigma and also oversees all of our training operations. Cindy and I have been working in the field of threat assessment for several decades and have worked through and taught a lot around this concept of the pathway to violence. We've spent careers with the U.S. Secret Service, and now working here at Sigma, we have worked extensively on threat investigations, threat assessment, training, and really studying and understanding this notion of the pathway to violence. So we want to spend a couple minutes today sharing with you what it is that we know, a little bit of the research behind that helped all of us to understand what this pathway is, and ultimately what it means for our ability to prevent acts of targeted violence. So first, we're going to start off with a really basic concept, that the notion that when we talk about violent behavior, we're actually talking about two different types of behavior. If we needed to, we could actually characterize acts of violence into one or two different buckets or one or two different categories. The first category is impulsive violence or reactive violence. We've got a picture of a cat here who looks cornered, who's hissing and ears back, and likely if the cat were standing up, we'd see an arched back and sort of extended fur. This cat looks like it's trying to defend itself. This cat looks like it is cornered. And when someone engages in an act of violence that's impulsive or reactive, they really are sort of reacting to what they feel is a threat near them or a threat to them. This type of violence happens a lot more often in our society, and it is violence that is really spur of the moment. When we talk to people who've engaged in this type of impulsive violence after it's happened, they really describe it in words like, I felt cornered, I felt trapped, I felt like I had to defend myself, and that they didn't expect to engage in violence when they went into that interaction. So it may have been a situation they went into, started to have a conversation, the conversation turns into an argument, and then they lose their temper and they get physically assaultive. So this is a type of violent behavior that happens a lot more often, at least in US society, but also with much lower lethality, a much less severe impact than acts of targeted violence. So targeted violence is this other form of violence, this other category of violent behavior. And here, the picture of the cat we see looks quite different. The cat here is in a predatory mode. It's stalking its prey. It's intending to do some harm, and it's seeking an opportunity to do so. It's thinking through options for doing so. So when we talk about predatory or targeted violence, this is an act of violence that really is, it's not spur of the moment. This is violence where someone has given some thought beforehand, not necessarily in the moment, before the moment, to violence or some intent to engage in harm. They've given some thought beforehand to where they want to do it, who they want to harm, how they want to do so. And it really is sort of goal-oriented violence. So as we talk about the pathway to violence here, this is the type of violence that we're talking about. And when we look at the headlines around acts of mass violence throughout the United States and actually anywhere in the world, this is the type of violence that we're talking about, whether it's a school shooting or a workplace shooting, a stalking of a celebrity or a sports figure, some forms of domestic violence. All of these are acts of targeted violence. And we're going to be talking
Marisa, one of the things that's pretty interesting, and I think a way for people to understand this is with the impulsive thing, people are almost surprised that they were even capable of doing that. And I think when you ask people, do you think you're capable of violence? Most people will say no. And then they're surprised because they were put in this position to either defend themselves or to protect something else. Yeah. But I think with targeted violence, you see that there's a decision made. There's this process, there's this thought in the planning, but that a clear decision versus I had no idea I was capable of doing that.
Absolutely, and that decision is often made well before the situation where they eventually engage in that violence. Quick review here, just to explain where we see acts of targeted violence. This is actually a graph that's come from a very helpful report that the FBI put out a couple of years ago. It was they did some large-scale research on active shooter incidents throughout the United States between the years of 2000 and 2013, and then they did a more focused analysis on incidents, active shooter incidents that involved acts of targeted violence. So this sort of thought out predatory violence, they looked for what they call pre-attack indicators. So this is a report, we're going to reference it at the end. There'll be a citation that you can pull up. But this graph here just helps us to see where acts of targeted violence may occur. We hear about them in schools and we hear about them in workplaces, but as we can see from this graph, they target all aspects of our society. They occur in healthcare facilities, they occur in houses of worship, they occur in venues, they occur at events like concerts, they occur in movie theaters, they occur against government buildings. So they occur in lots of different areas and in lots of different sectors of life. So let's take a closer look at these acts of targeted violence and what we can understand about the pathway to violence.
So let's just go over a couple of things that we learned through the research. And again, it's cited down here on the bottom of this slide where you can go to get more information, but FBI research, Secret Service research, looking into acts of targeted violence. And one of the things that they discovered from the research is that these are rarely random acts. Again, it goes back to that decision. It goes back to that planning. This isn't something where somebody just snapped and committed these acts. They're thought through, they're planned in advance, and they really do follow a behavior in a pattern that is a pathway. They start out with, this idea, and that idea stems from many different things, but they come up with an idea to do harm. And then they go into planning. What am I going to do? I'm going to do something. Now, what am I going to do? What am I actually going to, do to make my point, or whatever my motivation is? And then from the planning stage of, okay, now I know what I'm going to do. How do I do it? And that's that preparation stage. This preparation stage is also called attack-related behavior. It's getting the means to do what I'm going to do. It's getting the access to the place where I'm going to do it. Acquiring weapons. It's preparing. And it really is that last step before implementation. The FBI has done a lot of research on this preparation stage as well, and they said once a perpetrator, once a person who is planning this act gets to this preparation stage, they are truly close to implementation. It can be a day, it can be a week, it can be 2 weeks. There's no defined time, but that time period is short. And one of the things that we always talk about when we're looking at this pathway to violence is when you get information about someone, you really don't know where they are on this staircase of acting. You don't know if they're in the preparation stage until you ask some questions. You don't know if they're just in the planning stage until you start asking some questions. So the important thing is to act quickly, because you don't know where someone is until you start looking into it.
Yeah, and let me give a little bit of background on, we've talked about the FBI research, and there's been Secret Service research on this too, and it's really been this research into acts of targeted violence that showed this pathway to violence that we really hadn't seen before. One of the research efforts that the Secret Service undertook was a study of US school shooters, and they've done a couple of extensions of that study. And just as an example of this pathway, one of the school shooters that we studied in looking at these across the United States, we asked him first, why did you carry out this act of violence? And he said, well, I had a problem. I was being bullied extensively at school, and I had gone to all the adults I was supposed to go to, but the problem was still there, and I felt I had to solve it myself. So he was trying to solve a problem. And so he came up with an idea, and his idea was just to show up at school with the shotgun that he had in his home and look tough. So his initial idea on this pathway to violence was, I'm going to show up with a weapon, I'm going to look tough, and that these people who are bullying me will back off. That was his idea. And then he shared that idea with a couple of his friends, and he got some feedback that that idea and that initial plan wasn't going to be enough to stop the bullying. And in fact, he had less experience using weapons than a lot of his classmates did, and so he was probably going to look foolish and make himself even more of a target of bullying. So his friends convinced him to come up with a different plan. And his friends said, look, you can't just show up with the shotgun. You're going to need to shoot at people if you really want to get them to back off. And so they helped him to further this plan. And then they even got more involved. So they said, look, as long as you're going to be there with a shotgun, we know that there are 3 students who have been making your life miserable, but there are 11 other people we don't like either, including the school principal. So as long as you're going to be there with this weapon shooting at people, if you see any of these other 11 people that we don't like, we'd appreciate it if you would try to shoot them as well. So that plan evolved as well. And then they helped him to figure out how to load the shotgun. He didn't know how to do that. This is this preparation stage. They helped him figure out how to hide the shotgun down some baggy jeans and hide it when he got on the school bus and off the school bus before even getting into school. So that, again, is that preparation stage. And then he actually got to the point of carrying out the attack. And as he walked into school that day, he first yelled at everyone in the lobby, "You better run." He pulled out the weapon and he yelled, "You better run." Again, really hoping that if they just saw him with the weapon, he wouldn't have to do anything further. Some students ran, some students didn't, and he ended up carrying out that shooting. But it helps to illustrate this pathway that there is some initial idea, some reason why they're even considering violence, and then it evolves from there to a plan, preparation, and implementation. And Cindy, let me ask you, because one of the questions we often get is sort of why do people get on the pathway to violence in the first place?
Well, there are many different motivations. You just said he had a reason. He had a problem that he needed to be solved, and nobody was helping him solve it. And just to step back one second, it's like, just because, it's his reason, and it may not be, we may not understand it. It may not make sense to us, but it's their reasoning. And it could be anything from something like this, from bullying. It could be, I want to draw attention to a cause. I want to draw attention to something that is important to me that nobody seems to be listening to. Or I've got personal pain. I'm dealing with anguish. I'm despondent. There are so many things going on in my life that honestly, I don't feel like living anymore. And I know that if I go to school and I start shooting, that at some point somebody's going to end my pain, or they could be mad about something. There could be a grievance, but it's a multitude of reasons that we see people act this way. It is their personal belief. It's their personal feeling. It's their personal pain that they're feeling that, again, may not be significant to us. And we often hear, when people say, well, everybody gets bullied, or everybody loses, a boyfriend or a girlfriend in school, or everyone goes through parents getting a divorce. But I think it's really important that we understand that's how the person perceives this loss, this pain, not how we perceive it.
And I think it's really important too that we have heard in some aspects of threat assessment that there always has to be a grievance before someone gets on this pathway to violence. And I think you and I, in the course of our careers, see that that's not at all the case. There's some previous research called the Exceptional Case Study Project at the U.S. Secret Service that first helped us to see this pathway to violence in people who are trying to harm public officials and public figures. And oftentimes in those cases, in our previous careers in a federal agency, we would see that people would get on this pathway to violence because of some delusions they had, some complete separation from reality. There's one person who was someone who attempted an assassination, was interviewed by some of our colleagues, and he essentially said, look, I've been hearing voices for years telling me I either had to shoot up an elementary school or I had to try to kill a public official. And he felt like the better option was to kill a public official because fewer people would be harmed and kids wouldn't be hurt. But it was these voices telling him to do that. So we see this, we see command hallucinations sometimes prompt someone on the pathway to violence. We see delusions prompt someone on the pathway to violence. And just as you were saying before, that oftentimes people get on this pathway to violence as a last resort. They feel like they have no other options left to solve some personal pain, some personal problems. They're feeling overwhelmed. And they look to this as in part a suicide by cop, or maybe that's their primary motive, that I can't end my own life and I can't end my own pain, but I can get someone else to do it for me if I prompt this act of violence. So, all right, let's go on to more of what we know from these acts.
All right, so we often get this question in training about profiling, because I think a lot of people, especially if we're looking at, recent school shooting events, that it seems like all these people look the same, the people that are committing these acts. But what we learned in all the research that's been done is that we can't give an accurate profile of someone who's going to carry out this attack. Profiling is I think looking backwards. It's not looking forwards. It's what we look at is someone's behavior, not what they look like, because we know through our research and through the cases that you and I worked at Sigma, at the Secret Service, that they range in age, from very young to very old, that they are both male and female, that all races that have been involved in these types of attacks. It's not just a specific, socioeconomic group. It's not somebody that, comes from a rural setting or an urban setting. I mean, we can just go through everything. There's just no profile. And I think one of the most important things about that profiling piece is even if a certain percentage, fit some mold, what do we do with that other percentage? Do we just say, well, we're going to take our chances? The thing about saying there's no profile is we have to ask questions about their behavior. And if we get information that there is troubling behavior, that other people are concerned about them, that there's something that brings them up on other people's radar, then we have to start asking questions no matter what these people look like.
Yeah, exactly. All right, some other points here.
So, we've talked a little bit about earlier about, the motivation and possibly, the reasoning being, suicide by cop or help in ending the pain. So we do know that there is a fine line in some cases of targeted violence between suicide and homicide, that these people do want this pain to end. And they are often suicidal, and then they decide that they're going to carry this act out and harm others as well.
And I think what's really important to emphasize here, and we emphasize this in training all the time, is that the vast majority of people in this world who are suicidal are not going to be at risk of violence to others. But when we look into a case of someone threatening harm or someone who might be on that pathway to violence, about violence to others, we look to see what's the underlying situation. Are they feeling suicidal? And if so, then we can do some things in the very short term to help stabilize them and get them some help. So most people who are suicidal, not a risk of violence to others. But when we're looking at these acts of targeted violence and this pathway to violence, many people who are on that pathway are on that pathway in part because they are suicidal and they're looking for a way to end their pain, and for them, acting violently toward others, prompting some sort of violent confrontation, maybe a suicide by cop, is a way to help solve that pain.
The other thing we saw, and we, going back to the graphic, the pathway to violence graphic, is that we see this preparation. And we talked about it just a few minutes ago about sometimes this preparation stage, this attack-related behavior stage, the acquiring the means, acquiring the access, is very, very soon. Yes, it's the step right before implementation, but we're talking about now a time frame that we've seen that the FBI saw in this research, that it's quick. It's close to implementation. So again, we can't say, with any degree of percentage of it's going to be, one day or 1 week, but we do know that it's soon, that they do this preparation stage, this final step fairly shortly before the implementation stage.
Yeah, and I think the FBI findings, at least looking at the active shooter incidents that were targeted between 2000 and 2013, I think what they said is that for them, they saw preparation occurred in 2 weeks or less to
Right.
implementation. So really, from an investigative standpoint, if you're working a threat investigation, you're on a threat assessment team, and you see those signs of preparation, it's time for some immediate action
Right.
to see what you can do to get that person off the pathway to violence. Now, I want to sort of throw out for quick discussion for us, we've talked about people being on the pathway to violence. Is it possible to get them off the pathway to violence?
And it's a great question, and it's really, I think, the whole point of threat assessment is moving someone off that pathway to violence, is intervening and getting them off that pathway to violence. And I can think of, all the cases that we've worked where we've been able to intervene and get that help and support and get people on a better path, and getting them, trying to help them solve whatever their problem is.
And that's a key piece of the investigation. So really, when we run a threat investigation, run a threat assessment case, help coach threat assessment and threat management teams, essentially we're having them in shorthand look for a couple things. Is this person on a pathway to violence? But if so, not only where are they, that idea or plan or preparation or implementation, but really also, why are they on that pathway? Do they think violence is going to help solve a problem, achieve a goal, bring attention to a cause, end their own personal pain? Why are they considering violence as a possible solution, or why do they feel like violence may be the only option they have left, what they have to resort to? And that's such a key piece of it, that when you and I work cases, when our colleagues at Sigma work cases, we're trying to figure out not only are they on the pathway, but why? What are the circumstances or situations that's gotten them to the point where they're even considering this? And one piece I do want to add here that we didn't have a slide on is that it's a common misconception that these acts of mass violence, active shooter events, mass lethality, targeted violence are carried out by people that we could label as a psychopath or a sociopath, and that is absolutely not the case. Only a very, very, very small percentage of cases that I've handled in my career, Cindy, I think that you've handled in yours, would fit that label. People who really don't have any ability to show any empathy, who don't care what happens to anyone else. The acts of targeted violence that we see time and again are carried out by people who are relatively normal. It may be hard to understand, but have hit circumstances where they feel overwhelmed and they feel like life isn't worth living anymore, and they want to do something on their way out, solve a problem, call attention to a situation, etc. And so when we can figure out what those underlying drivers are, why are they considering this? Why do they feel like they have to resort to violence? That is really a guide map for us at that point about what we can try to help them solve.
I think a lot of it is again, that question why, and what's the story behind the behavior. If we're getting information and people are concerned, and maybe people are starting to be afraid, or they're hearing something from a person that's concerning them quite a bit, that this person may do something to do harm. Really, our question is, what's going on and why? What is that person's story? And then once we start to get the information about that story, I always say it's the so what and the now what. So what is, what's the story? What's going on? The now what is, how do we intervene, get this person off the pathway to do harm and on a better pathway, because they clearly need that intervention. And I think one of the things that when we teach threat assessment and we spend a lot of time on is the now what. How do we manage this now? How do we get them off that pathway to violence and manage to get them on a better pathway and keep them there? And that is, as we talk about the 4 steps of the threat assessment process of identifying someone, asking all those whys, asking those questions, and then, figuring out what I have, and then figuring out what to do with it. And that really truly is asking those questions and figuring out the why, because there is a why behind all of this, except in those very, very, very small cases that you just explained. It's very small that these people are just, that they're not in a, just in a bad place, or, at the end of their rope, or feel like there's no other answer. Those folks are very, very rare, those sociopathic type perpetrators.
Right, absolutely, in this type of violence. And I think that what you were just saying about all the things we do to help manage a case, when we get to that point, okay, this person is on a pathway to violence, how do we get them off? What's that guide map? What are they trying to solve? How can we help them find a non-violent solution to solve their situation, maybe get some support or treatment for a condition that hasn't been appropriately diagnosed or treated yet, or just some emotional support in going through something that may be incredibly tough and overwhelming for them. How do we help them get those resources to get them off the pathway to violence and onto a better path? I know you and I have talked about this often, but that piece of it is part of what makes threat assessment work so incredibly gratifying, is when we can find that solution, because we can, it's there. It's just a matter of digging for it as an investigator to figure out what is going to help. And as we talk about in training, sometimes our fastest way to find this solution is asking that person directly, the person who's threatening, the person who's planning that violent act, what would make things better? What would help solve the problem? And oftentimes they come up with cheaper, faster, easier solutions than we would necessarily as a team or as advisors in helping people to work through it. So,
and sometimes they just want to be heard. I mean,
yeah.
Sometimes that threat assessment team, or when we've been in the position, they're just like, I just wanted somebody to know.
Yeah.
I just wanted to tell my side of the story. And that, that in and of itself, like you said, it's cheaper, it's faster, it's better. That could be what they needed, just to be heard.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we wrap up, just for the folks who've been with us today, a couple of take-home points that this pathway to violence really shows us that people who have engaged in these acts of targeted violence in schools and workplaces and houses of worship, healthcare facilities, colleges and universities against public officials and public figures, they typically follow this pathway to violence. They come up with an idea, they develop a plan, they prepare for the violent act, and then they actually implement it. And that it's possible to prevent these, because this behavior, this idea and this planning behavior is often observable and often known to others. These people often tell other people, like we saw in that school example, what they're thinking about and planning to do. So that behavior is often available to us as investigators and available to us to run a preventive investigation. And really at the heart of all this, we're trying to figure out if someone has made a threat on social media, in a homework assignment, to a coworker, in a store, wherever the case may be, that we can look to see, are they on this pathway to violence? And if so, why? And figure out ways to get them off the pathway and onto a better path. That ultimately that this work is done very well by multidisciplinary teams, and we get into that in the concept of threat assessment, which we'll do in other videos, but that this work is quite feasible to prevent acts of targeted violence by looking to see if someone's on that pathway and figuring out the best way to get them off that pathway. So we've got a couple of resources for more information on this that are good. We've got the report up here. FBI.gov has that report, a study of pre-attack behavior of active shooters between 2000 and 2013. So a lot of the findings we cited were from that study, and then also the Safe School Initiative. We've got a guide to how to handle threatening situations in schools that we co-wrote in our time at the U.S. Secret Service. And then there's also a great documentary that you can pull up that was done shortly after the 2012 shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School, called The Path to Violence, that helps to explain these concepts as well. And we've got our contact information here too. Cindy and I are available anytime for questions at training@sigmatma.com, or our numbers up here. We're also available on Twitter We thank you for being with us today and helping us all to prevent acts of targeted violence.
Thank you, everyone.